So before I get started, just a note on the edition that I'm using. This is sort of a shameless plug. This is the study edition that I created with Graham Fitch. It was actually part of when we set up our online academy. We did a crowdfunding project, and a few of our patrons kindly sponsored works for us to feature in this way. And so I'm really delighted to have this one featured because it's been a really popular one ever since. Now, I should say that other editions do exist. There's no need to specifically use this one. I do particularly like it though, obviously in my biased opinion, because it's got, firstly it makes the research easy because it's got some quite nice notes and things in the beginning. Then it's got an urtext section which is clean so that you can write your fingerings and things in on it. And then it's got a very detailed annotated version where Graham's written in his fingerings and he's given a lot of notes and suggestions for how to play the piece. So that will be useful as a guideline for me. And then it's got practice worksheets at the back where with QR codes to videos. And these take some of the main areas of difficulty and break them up or give exercises and things to make it easier to master them. So I'll certainly be using those because they're a way for me to try and tackle things in a shorter space of time and hopefully more efficiently. So firstly, just starting out with some background, and the notes in this edition make it a bit easier. Chopin originally wrote the piece in 1830, but I think it was only published in 1870, so quite long after his death. It was written for his sister as an exercise for his second piano concerto. So I would recommend, as part of the research, listening to this piece and perhaps listening to the concerto as well, because there may be some similarities in terms of melodies and motifs. The piece has quite a rich 20th century history too, in that it features in the movie The Pianist. It was played by Władysław Szpilman, who's featured in The Pianist, or it's his biography. I think it was one of the last things played on Radio Warsaw, or it was the piece that was played when he played it for the SS commander who brought him food when he was on the run. There's also a story about a lady, a Polish pianist called Natalia Karp, who played it in a concert at a concentration camp, and as a result her life was spared. So quite I suppose quite a dark history as well in a way. So there's quite a lot of a backstory to this piece. Now, I'm going to start off with just a little bit of analysis, and as I said earlier, it's useful to do because it's going to make learning the piece less daunting and hopefully help me create something that's more satisfying or closer to my musical objective within the limits of the time that I have. So I'm just going to play through bits of it now and make a few comments on it. So one of the first things I'd do in a quick study would just be to do a playthrough or read through, sight reading, and start to think about how I'm going to approach the piece, plan the strategy, and perhaps also even start thinking as early on as possible about things like fingerings and so on. So firstly, it opens with this, this chord passage. Repeat it again. Now, it's important to get that right because those are the first things that somebody heard. Now, I'm just sight reading this now. Well, I've played through it once or twice, but so I haven't learned it formally yet. So my playing is certainly not going to be particularly good. But there's a video that Graham did on that opening because he feels that is something that people just gloss over and get wrong so often. So I'm going to watch that video and see how I apply and try and apply some of the suggestions from it there. And I'll include a link to it in the video notes. Now here, so after that introduction, we've got this beautiful singing line. Now, obviously that's got to be cantabile, and the other useful bit of background information here is to know that Chopin loved the bel canto style of Italian opera or singing, and I think actually taught quite a few singers as well. So that one needs to imagine a soprano singing that line, as I say, with a beautiful singing tone, and you have to imagine that it's being sung when it's being played. I think Graham actually writes in his annotations at certain points sing, which, yeah, definitely the style that we're going for there. It's also really useful for an interpretation to have a story or a narrative behind the piece. And I wouldn't say that they're necessarily the most apt pictures, but I often do get pictures in my mind. And I'll share this with you. It's a personal thing, so I'm not suggesting that this would be useful to anyone else. But I think I'm imagining something almost like a scene from like La Bohème, you know, in a Bohemian Paris, in an attic or a darkened room, a wooden darkened room. And there's an elderly man, a wizened old man with a grey beard, and he's wearing sort of rags or whatever. And he says, "Come, let me tell you a story." And that's this. And he says, "Come closer." And then, a long time ago, and I was imagining a scene in a movie where you've got a narrator who introduces something and then is talking over the imagery or the footage, which is now going back in time. And or the other thing that I think of with this is a snow globe, and you're looking down. I just get this feeling in this piece that you're looking down on a story, and although also still deeply attached to it, so it's not in a detached way that one is doing that. Then, just going on a little bit further, I see here there's some nasty looking runs. Now, analysis is useful here because this, I think, is an F sharp harmonic minor scale. I might be wrong with that, but I think it is. So just knowing that that's a scale makes it a bit less daunting. After this first opening section, we have a middle section. So we've got an A section and a B section. The middle section has this so it's a bit more. So after the A section, we've got a middle section, which is in the major. I think it's A major. So after this opening section, the A section, we've got a middle section, B section, which is in a major key. So it's definitely ready, just making some mental notes about fingering there. And then it repeats in minor. So a little bit more ominous, understated there. And then we've got this dance-like section. And that, I think Chopin wrote quite a lot of dance music, mazurkas and things like that. So I could imagine there, I'm thinking that there's a happier interlude here to the sad story, and then maybe there's some kind of a formal dance in period costumes or whatever, or sort of a slight a provincial peasant dance perhaps, so maybe not as formal, but there's some kind of an event. And then we go back to the melody again. That's now an octave higher, but it's still very similar. So this is in ternary form, it's ABA. So that's how I'm definitely going to be learning it, breaking it up into those sections. And then we've got all of this nasty looking fioriture. Okay, that I'm going to have to learn and figure out exactly where they start and end, and do that in a more structured way. So that we're definitely going to have to tackle. But what I have noticed there, it's also a scale, and I think it's E major, which once again will make it a lot easier to learn, because I should know an E major scale. So so that helps. And then it ends off on ends on C sharp minor. So So that's basically the first stage, is the background and the analysis to getting started with this work. So with the background analysis done, it's now the next step is to start planning how I'm going to go about actually learning and tackling the piece. So part of that's going to involve breaking it up into sections and then figuring out a strategy for how I'm going to approach each of them. And the other part of it will be writing the fingering in. It's useful to do this as soon as possible, and even though perhaps in the very early stages there's a period in which you can alter the fingerings because you might just find that what you initially had might not be correct or might not be the most suitable for your hand, and that a better option emerges. It's important to bed that down earlier on. I can't actually tell you how many times not doing that has meant spending ages relearning bits and trying to get the right fingering in, only to then have one of the wrong ones come up or cause confusion when on the spot performing. So definitely a note to myself is to try and stick to the fingerings and to try and embed that from an early stage. So then looking at breaking the piece up into sections is a way of tackling it. There's a lovely saying in Africa, so that the way that you eat the elephant is piece by piece. That might seem obvious, but I think what we tend to do is we tend to overload the working memory, try and do everything at once, and just keep on playing through the piece. And then it should be no surprise that it takes forever to learn that way, and then it falls apart, only to still fall apart in various places. So my sections are going to be as follows. I've got this introduction, and then the A section has the and that I will learn separately. But just coming back to the introduction, there's a few techniques that I'm going to show that I'll use to learn those chords and to hopefully make sure I voice it correctly. Then in the when the melody comes in the A section, I'll be learning that separately, and there's also some techniques I'm going to use to learn the left-hand accompaniment and the trills plus the runs as well. The middle section will be quite similar in terms of how I learn that, because it's also got that the bass figuration is very similar, but I'll break that down and learn that also as a section. And then I will have to learn how when the A section returns, I'll have to learn the differences, and there's a bit of new material there, once again separately, together, and there's another run, this bar 53, which I'm going to have to break up as well and find a strategy for learning that. And then there's the fioriture at the end, which looks a bit traumatic, particularly this with the one with the 35 written below it. So there's also going to have to be, I'm going to have to think of a way to approach that. But once again, if I approach this in individual sections and have an appropriate strategy for each of them, then hopefully I'll be able to learn the piece. So I'm just going to look a bit at some of the strategies and techniques that I'm going to use. So I talked about breaking the piece up into sections, and that's really, really important. And those sections I'm going to break up further into little bite-sized chunks, because the whole thing that we tend to do when we learn a piece is that we are tempted to play on. So what happens is, even if we've started playing a difficult section and we've practiced it, instead of repeating it and making sure that we're embedding the correct information in our memory banks, as it were, we tend to play on a bit, because it's just so tempting to do that, particularly if a difficult bit is followed by an easier bit. And I think there's some really good examples of where that might become a problem in this piece, because quite a bit of it I can just about sight read, and then there's a few bits which I need to work on a bit harder. So it's going to be a bit of an exercise in willpower, also because it's such a beautiful piece, to just not keep on playing on. So the one thing is the sections. The other is I'm going to identify, there's the few more difficult bits. There's the trills, ferrature, and runs. So I'm going to have an approach to coming up with each of those. And what I'm going to do is, I'm using Graham's concept he calls Q spots. So those are the difficult spots on a piece that throw you. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on some of those and learn them in isolation from an early stage and play them as consistently as possible. So even if I only have like 5 or 10 minutes to practice, one day I'll just do the Q spots. So that way at least I'm focusing the little time that I have on the parts that need the greatest attention. So what I'm going to do now is just look at some specific strategies as to how I'm going to approach some of the different parts of the piece. The opening section, I mentioned earlier that it's important that this is the first thing that somebody's going to hear. So what I'm going to do is I want to make sure that I get the voicing right for this. One way of doing that is an exercise where you'd play, I want to voice the tops here a bit. So it goes... So I could do this... tapping, or just play the top voice. Ooh. So there's a few ways of practicing that. I'm also going to pay careful attention to the rest. They're written in there, they must be there for a reason. And I think with coming back to my narrative about the old man telling a story, I think that he might be quite deliberate in the way he's talking and speaking, there's setting up for the drama of this and this. So I think it needs to be quite well defined and articulated. Then coming to the melody. Where the melody comes in. So this is I'm first going to do this separately and make sure I get this bass. So I'll probably practice without the pedal first. Graham's got quite a neat exercise here. What you do is you hold the middle note, play the notes on the outside. There's variations of... a technique that's important there is the wrist circles. Not having a rigid or fixed wrist is going to be important there to make that even and so on. Another exercise that I will use, there's some bits where it's quite tricky in terms of jumps. So practicing those jumps, because it's just too difficult to stretch within the hands, will be quite important. With quite a few of them, so fingering is a very personal thing, and I think so quite a few of Graham's fingerings really work well. I think we may possibly have quite similar sized hands, so I do tend to use quite a few of them, but there's a few where I think I'll try my own and hopefully not be too misguided in what my decisions are. But there's quite a few of these I'm going to have to decide pretty early on, because for example, in bar 12, that I can easily do is 5, 4, 1, 2. But there are bits where it becomes really awkward to do, 5, 3, 1, 2. There are bits where it's really awkward to do 5, 3, and you have to do 5, 2. So for example, I think in bar 54, to go 5, 3 there, from the G natural, or so the F double sharp, to the E natural, I find that really, really awkward to do in my hand. But then what it does mean is then you've got to jump faster, because if you do 5, 2, you've got to then jump all the way to the C sharp and then play 2 with the A sharp. So that means that you've just got to, I guess, practice those jumps there a bit. Another way that I can practice that, just to learn those notes and those distances, is I'll start off with an easier example. So let's see. So in the beginning we've got that's one way to learn them and practice them. And I'll also use a technique which I'll use much more for trills and runs as well, called chaining. So instead of just playing that through and playing on and hoping that I've learnt it, there's a more difficult bit in bar 54, and I'll maybe use that as an example. So we have... So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add a little bit each time. So that's the whole bar. So I'm going to practice again. Then if I go to the next bar, and the idea is rather than just playing all of that together, is doing that in sections, making sure that each of them, and this is going to come up again and again throughout learning the piece, and making sure that I can play each of them before putting them together and combining them into something longer. So that's quite a neat way of learning it. I'll also use that approach to chaining to putting it together. So for example, if we go from where the melody comes in. So I'm just going to make sure I land on that A there. So. That's one way to put it together. A better example of that, actually, but that bar might not be the best example. The better example would be bar 15, where there's a run, a descending run in the right hand. So I'll just do the first. And carry on doing it like that and building it up that way. And obviously, if you make a mistake, then just go back and make sure that you sort of rectify that and make sure that you haven't pushed the save button in your memory at the wrong point. Then moving along to some of the nasty fioriture. Well, I'm gonna, I still have to learn this. Firstly, just recognizing that that is an E major scale is really useful. I'll learn it separately. I'll get an idea of where I'm aiming for, because I can't think of every note. They've got to be thought of in groups. And then I'm also going to try and roughly allocate them to the left-hand notes when I put them together. So that's how I'm going to go about learning that bit. So those are broadly my strategies for learning the piece. Break it down into sections, use some very specific tools and techniques for certain areas that are problematic, slowly build it up using chaining, and hope that means I've learnt it in a fairly robust way. Alongside this, I'll be writing in fingerings and just checking them. And at a fairly early stage, I will then make a decision to embed those fingerings and then hopefully stick with them.